we have been talking about family. Family is important. And, it means that your relationship with your brothers and sisters, your relationship with your mom and dad, your relationship with your parents, it's all so very important. And you can gain the whole world. You can be the richest person on the face of the planet. But if your family relationships stink, then your life pretty much stinks too. It really does define, so much about who you are and what you value, how your family really works. And we've been walking through this series, and the interesting thing in everybody's family is you kind of get what you get. You didn't choose your family of origin. You were just born into it, and there's all kinds of different families. Some families have single parents. Some people have two parents, and there are all kinds of different family structures, but God has an ideal for families. And many times our reality is a little bit different than that. And so as we talk about families, we're like, oh no, my family doesn't look like the ideal. But you know what? Here's the good news. Nobody's family looks like the ideal. Everybody's normal until you get to know them, is the paradigm. And so we all kind of strive to be who God has called us to be and help our family to represent how God defined family to be. And that's why we call this series The Family Portrait, because we're painting a picture of Christ's ideal for a family and some of the biblical principles that we can actively participate in family relationships. And so we talked a little bit about the premise of this whole thing, which is in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And what makes a family work is the same thing that makes other relationships work. It makes churches work. It would make communities work if we practice it, but we don't see it very often. And that is mutual submission. They were all serving one another out of a heart that's full of love. And that's what you want for your family. That's what you want for your church. And we talked last week about raising great children, and so many of you parents are just doing a heroic job, and I just want to step aside here just for a minute and cheer on you single parents. Oh, you guys are heroes. I prayed with several single parents after the service last Sunday, and I got to tell you, you single parents, you are heroes. Thank you for coming to church, bringing your family to church. Many of you work not one job, but two jobs, and then you come home to another job, raising your kids. And we just want to celebrate your unbelievable effort in making that happen. But we summarize this whole series from Ephesians 5 and 6, and it says this. It says, husbands, love your wives and be considerate. Wives, respect your husbands. Children, honor and obey your parents. And parents, don't exasperate your kids. It's pretty cut and dried, isn't it? We think that we can just, enact that, no problem, but it really is a little tougher than we think. And this week, we're going to look at a passage of Scripture and speak to the wives of how they might treat husbands, because we figure on Super Bowl Sunday, it's kind of the husband's day, right? And that's such a sexist thing. We next week on Valentine's Day, we're going to teach husbands to love your wives. And so if you are a wife here today and you've been wanting your husband to get this right for a long time, you cannot miss next week, Valentine's Day, February 14th. And we've got some special things in store. We're going to give all of you ladies a gift on your way out. It's going to be a lot of fun. But today we're going to speak to wives about how they can treat their husbands and the secret to raising great husbands. And we're going to look at one of the most politically incorrect verses in the entire Bible, and it should be interesting. So Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 through 24, it says this, wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives must submit to their husbands in everything. And again, this is right after that verse that we're using as the foundational verse of this whole passage. He's taking a specific principle of submitting to one another. Raise your hand if you're a one another. Of submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. He's taking that specific principle and applying it, or a general principle, and applying it in a very specific way to wives. And he applies it to children, he applies it to husbands a little bit later, but in this case, he's applying it strictly to wives. And the word submit is an interesting word because it means to arrange under, to put under. That, the husband is the head of the home in the sense that he is the provider and the protector, that he is covering his family, and to arrange under. Ephesians 5:33, however, each of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husbands. There's been all kinds of books that have been written about the differences between men and women. How many of you have ever read the book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus? It's probably the more popular, trendy one in our culture, but there's all kinds of books related to this. There is a difference between men and women. And Paul highlights this, and he does it in such an incredible way because a husband submits to his wife's need for love. But a wife submits to her husband's need for respect. And it's a little bit different in our primary orientation. A woman needs love primarily. A man needs respect. And I know this is a little tough to get your head around because, well, wait a minute, don't I as a woman need respect? Well, of course you do. And don't you as men need love? Well, of course you do. But it's not necessarily your primary motivation. Wives, if you want to blow away your husband or the men in your life, look at them and say, I respect you. I respect how hard you work. I admire you. All of these things and words are things that resonate so much in our heart. And when we look at the word submit, you can't quite biblically get around the fact that in the order of things, God's ideal is that men are the head over the family. Believe me, I've tried. It's so not palatable at all in our culture that it's difficult to even say. But let's talk a little bit about what that leadership might look like. Because he says this, and I'll talk more about this next week, but Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, when he's speaking to husbands, this is what leadership in a godly home might look like. It says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So just as Jesus died on a cross and gave up everything for the church, men are supposed to die and give up everything for their family and for their wife. And listen to this, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or without any blemish, but holy and blameless. Now, if you're a wife here today, wouldn't you love it if your husband brought you in and just honored you and esteemed you and lifted you up and presented you without blemish, without blame, without criticizing, but just loved you and poured out his life upon you? I think there's probably not a woman in this room that would say, I would love to follow that kind of leadership. That sounds fantastic. But God has uniquely placed kind of a different DNA in men and different DNA in women. And that leadership really kind of falls in two general categories. Men are really designed by God to protect and to provide. To protect, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 14, it says, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them, because they were facing imminent attack. It says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. What he's addressing is the men, because men are we're wired to protect. We love to protect. When my wife and I went to Universal Studios, and they have that haunted house there, and we walked through that, and I love haunted houses because my wife just screams her head off, and she'll get behind me, and I'll stand there. I won't tell her I'm scared too. That giant, tall Frankenstein just freaks me out for some reason, but she'll scream, and there's something about a guy, we're walking through there, and Trisha's just grabbing my arm, and she's hiding behind me, and she's cuddling with me, and oh, you got to protect me. And I'm like, I just think it's the greatest thing in the world. I'm like, let's go again and again. It's awesome. There's also something about providing in the heart of every man. 1 Timothy 5:8. Listen to this admonition that Paul offers. He says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so he's speaking to men again, and he's saying, you're the protector, you're the provider of your family. And for you to shirk this responsibility is to shirk something that God has uniquely provided for you. Now, a lot of times it's difficult because how can you give unconditional respect? And what does that even look like? And I think the easiest way to explain that is to look at it from the other perspective. If you're a wife here, would you expect unconditional love? If you're not that unlovable, and if you're a little mean or a little callous or a little tired or a little snippety, does that necessarily give the right for your husband to not love you that day or not treat you in a loving manner? Of course not. We believe in unconditional love. There's something in all of our hearts that long for unconditional love. Well, unconditional respect is a lot like that. Even when we don't deserve it, men really are wired and desire this respect. And this respect is so essential for our lives. And you may be here and you're like, well, what if my husband is not really even following Christ? He's not serving God. Well, then doesn't it mean that I just can not respect him? I mean, he's not doing anything that's worthy of respect. And actually, in the Bible, there's an actual response to that. In 1 Peter chapter 3. And it says this, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words. Think about that. Won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornments such as elaborate hairstyles or the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self. The unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. That your great respect and great holiness and great godliness can begin to change hearts, and you can win over others even without using words. Now, I hasten to add, if you look at leadership in the Bible, you have to look at the leadership of Jesus. You remember the disciples, they're just fighting over who is first and who's the greatest, and it was a common argument as they were walking along the road. And Jesus responded by putting on the lowest of servants' garments, kneeling down at each one of their feet and washing their feet. And he said, I'm doing this to serve as an example. This is what leadership looks like. And dads, next week we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit about that leadership and about that servanthood and putting on the servant's garments and kneeling down and washing the feet of your wife. But I think men are a lot like turtles. Probably one of my earliest memories is we lived in Missouri, and I was feeding a turtle lettuce, and the turtle didn't like it very much, the giant 3-year-old kid who had him in a cardboard box, and he just lashed out. If you've ever seen a snapping turtle, they're like scary because they just lash out so fast, and he bit me right here between my fingers, and my earliest memory was looking up and just blood dripping down my hand, but the interesting thing about turtles, if you ever had a turtle, you kind of have to coax the turtle out of its shell, right? You got to hold some lettuce out there, and you've got to be real still because if you startle the turtle, he just comes back into his shell. And if you're sitting there thumping the turtle on its hard shell, chances are that turtle's never going to come out.